ladies and gentlemen. I'm Corinna Fehr, and I warmly welcome you to the third event of our Vienna Behavioral Economic Network. VBEN. What is VBEN? VBEN is a platform for scientists, for decision makers in politics and business, for students and for interested people. And our target is to bring the results out of behavioral economics and experimental economics to a broader audience. And why we do this? Because we really believe and we are convinced that the results out of behavioral economics have power, really power. And we also believe that we can change the world a little bit with it and make it a little bit better. Who is VBEN? VBEN is different people. First of all, the University of Vienna with Jean-Robert Thiron. Then our host, the Federation of Austrian Industries, with Clemens Wallner, who normally sits here. Da bist du, das geht ja gar nicht. With Clemens Wallner. And then Styria Digital One. Then the Austrian Press Agency. Fair Advice and Partners in Zurich. Netzkundig with Eberhard Laut. And me, Corinna Fehr. I am an expert in conflict and project management, and I'm the president of the VBEN, and well, I'm doing that events can take place. I'm doing the organization, the funding, the marketing, the design. And everything, yeah. Today, what we are doing today we have two speakers. Our keynote speaker is Uri Gneezy from the University of San Diego, and he tells us about how incentives lead to better performance. And we have Rudolf Vogel from the Raiffeisen International Bank. He is head of human resources, and he's responsible for 50,000 employees, and he tells us the practical views about incentives, performance, and motivation. And some of you may have heard of Uri Gneezy, but there's one person in the room who's really predicted to announce him, and that's Jean-Robert Thiron. Jean-Robert, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Hey. Okay, welcome everyone to this event of the Vienna Behavioral Economics Network, the third event already, and I'm speaking to you as the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board, which we recently created to kind of guide the scientific content of this evening. So our main task is really to determine the academic speakers that are presenting here. And that sounds like an easy job, but I think it's actually a very difficult job because we have set our aims very high. We want, on the one hand, we want absolute top speakers, academic top speakers, to be here, to be able to transfer, to present you the latest research in behavioral economic and experimental economics. But on the other hand, we're also looking for people who are able to communicate their research to a broad audience, someone who is concerned with applying insights of behavioral economics to real life. After all, as Corinna has pointed out, that's the main purpose of this event, to transfer ideas from academia into the broader society and to engage into a dialogue. That's also why we have a third part here of this event where we will discuss and have drinks and a little finger food at the end, where we can do some networking and some exchange of ideas. So this is not an easy job. Finding someone who can do both of these things is not easy. Unfortunately, many academics in academia who are brilliant enough to publish in Econometrica are often not able to explain their ideas to lay people in an accessible way. But with today's speaker, we really hit the jackpot. He is excellent at both, and we're extremely pleased that he managed to bring Professor Gneezy here to this place, to Vienna, despite, or if we believe his research, because we don't pay speakers any money for the presentation. So let me tell you a few things about his CV. Uri studied in Tel Aviv and Tilburg in the Netherlands, and after he earned his PhD, he returned to Israel as a lecturer. And after some years, he landed a job at the Booth School, Chicago Business School, where he was assistant professor and later associate professor. And then he became full professor at UC San Diego's business school, the Rady Business School, which is located in beautiful La Jolla, Southern California. So when you look at his CV, Uri had an amazing career. Today, Uri is one of the leading researchers in the field of experimental economics. And I just looked it up. The REPEC ranking, he's among the top 10 worldwide in the field. So truly outstanding researchers. He has published more than a dozen papers in what economists call the top 5 journals. And he has published with many eminent scholars as co-authors. So everyone wants to be a co-author of Uri. And he's also the section editor of the prestigious and influential journal called Management Science. So I think, you know, this is all truly impressive when you read this. Uri is a star, no doubt, but the reason I personally admire Uri is not so much his academic CV, but his really unusual creativity. He's really outstanding in this field. He has an ability to see things that are completely obvious once you notice them, but nobody seems to notice them. Everyone seems to be blind to them. And that's, I think, one of his biggest talents. He has a keen interest in understanding what ordinary people really do, and in particular how they respond to incentives. Probably we'll hear a little bit about that today. And his approach is unconventional in many ways. He's not developing any grand theories that are based on some heroic assumptions. Instead, he uses very often very simple experiments to investigate behavior and how it can be changed. Uri is also, as I said, one of the world's leaders in experimental economics, and he's not only doing lab experiments, but also field experiments. So both of these things, he's excellent. To give you just some ideas of his field experiments, and that he, I would say, looks in unusual places for his discoveries. So for example, he studies what happens in Israeli kindergartens when you start finding people for picking up their kids late, or what happens in a gym in Chicago when you pay people to go to the gym and then you stop paying them. Will they still go, or will they stop going? Yeah? He studies gender differences and how they depend on what societies you grow up. He also studies whether we have an aversion to lie and deceive people, and what may induce us to do it anyway. Yeah? How can you incentivize people to lie and deceive or not to do it? These are just a few examples, and we will hear some examples in a minute. But I would like to emphasize that Uri's research is not only driven by a deep curiosity to understand how things really work. He also wants, as Corinna pointed out, to use insights from behavioral economics to better our conditions. And that's why you are one of the ideal people in this world to be at this event. He uses incentives to improve good habits and to decrease bad ones. He has a consulting company that tells companies and other organizations how to do that. So if you're here today with your business, perhaps contact him afterwards. He might offer also some good services, perhaps some competition to fair advice also. On a personal level, I know Uri as a witty, fascinating, and sometimes charming person, but I have to warn you, he also has a provocative side. Yeah? So let's see which side he will present today. Whichever it is, I have always known Uri as a very thought-provoking person, and I'm sure that his presentation will give us a lot of material to think about and to follow up upon in what Rudolf Vogel will say afterwards, and in a discussion we will have afterwards. I encourage you all to participate in discussion, ask and share your views. And if not, we have also opportunities to chat with each other afterwards over drinks and a little finger food. So please join me all in welcoming Professor Uri Gneezy. Thank you so much.
So I'm going to talk a bit about exercising, losing weight, gaining weight, and I think it relates very much to what Jean-Robert just did. I'm from Israel. You can't tell by my accent because I have a perfect British accent, but and over the years I lost about 5,000 kilos and gained 5,020, something like that. But the interesting observation that I had a few days ago was that whenever I gain weight, Americans don't comment on that. When I lose weight, they tell me I look great. That's good. And in Israel, it's just the opposite, right? So when I lose weight, people ignore it. But when I gain weight, they say, oh, you're eating well, right? So I'm not used to people saying nice things. You know, it's not part of the culture. I'm in the US for 16 years, but still I'm learning. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to talk with you about behavioral economics as I see it. So you, for example, Jean-Robert, you mentioned behavioral economics and experimental economics is interchangeable in some cases. And indeed, when I started experimental economics, I was in the field of experimental economics. And now I call myself a behavioral economist simply because experiments are a kind of tool that we are using, a very important tool. And like you said, we're using lab experiment and field experiment, and I'll describe mostly field experiments today, not because I don't like lab experiments. At least half of my work is still in the lab, but that's what I think is more appealing for companies, for to spread the word. The way I see behavioral economics is not as some kind of a set of tricks to manipulate behavior, especially not when you look at behavior change. I'm not going to be able to cause you to stop smoking or to exercise more simply by shifting some things. It's a much deeper thing, much deeper change that we need to make. And the challenge over there, and in many other cases, is that the incentives are there already. So the guy I like to think about is a 55-year-old overweight person that goes to the physician, and the physician tells him, look, you're pre-diabetic. If you'll walk half an hour a day, your life is going to be so much better. And this guy doesn't even do that. So it's not you should run a marathon and your life will be better, but walk half an hour a day, and then otherwise, the diabetes is a very serious disease, and it doesn't do that. The question is, how can we introduce incentives into a situation where the incentives are so strong already? So that's the challenge that I'm going to try and discuss. But the idea is that in classical economics, we started with a set of assumptions, and you don't really have to care about the validity of these assumptions in many cases because they have some kind of internal beauty. So if you have axioms, and if you have this axiom, it's a mathematical exercise in many cases. Behavioral economics doesn't have, at least the stuff I'm doing doesn't have this internal beauty. It's either it's useful or it's not interesting. And useful doesn't mean that we can necessarily take it from the experiment to the real world, but we can understand more about how people behave. And now you mentioned, and I'm going to talk a bit about things that I done early on with Aldo Rustakini about crowding out. Crowding out is when I give you incentives and it actually makes you less likely to perform this activity. I'll explain more in a few minutes maybe. But the point that I want to make now at the beginning, at the outset, is that I cannot go to a CEO of a company and tell her, look, I can design incentives that will destroy your company. Please hire me, right? You have to go and say, look, I can design incentives that will make your company amazing. The problem with this is that behavioral economists tend to overpromise relative to at least what we know how to do now. So we go to different, and maybe that's the opposite message of what you wanted me to come here, but since you're not paying me, I can say whatever I want. We very often promise much more than we can deliver. It doesn't mean that we won't be able to deliver in the future, but I'm just saying that, it's not that I know how to cause people to stop smoking, for example, or things like that. We have some ideas about stuff that work, and we have things that we try to develop, but we are very far from having this magic thing that will do this. after this introduction, it's time to talk about some research, I think. I want to start actually with something that has nothing to do with things maybe that interest you, but that will emphasize why experiments are so important. So why do you need to actually have data before you jump into conclusion? Before you design policy, you really need to understand what's going on. So we're doing, we are looking at PISA tests. If you know what PISA test, that's the test that the OECD runs in, more than, I think close to 200 countries with 15-year-old kids. And that is basically used in order to rank countries according to performance in math, for example. And I tried to look, my internet was too slow. I don't know where is Austria in math in the last PISA ranking. But the US is number 39, I think, in the new one. Or in 2012, it was number 36, which is quite surprising because the US invests so much effort, so many resources, so much money in education. It's a real open question. Why is it that the US performs so poorly in these comparison tests relative to other countries? And this kind of question is something that education people are really busy trying to understand. So if you look at the results, people look at Finland, for example, that invests relatively little and has a lot of success. So you try to overhaul your education system in order to try and be more like Finland and less like the US maybe. A huge amount of resources are devoted to this. It's not small things. People look at the relevant ministers look at the results of the PISA test and try to understand why it happens and really shift the policy towards changing it. And we as skeptical economists looked at it and said, well, maybe there is something else over there. So the something else that could be over there is that if you look at the production function, what leads to successful grade over there? It's your knowledge, which is the claim that we are measuring knowledge, and the effort that you put on the test itself. Right? You go to the test. Now imagine this, 15-year-old kids, you bring them into a class like this. They sit for a couple of hours, see hundreds of questions. They don't know later on the results. The school, the teachers, the parents, no one knows the results. So it's what in the literature it's called the low-stake exam because they have no consequences to themselves. Why would a 15-year-old sit down and do this? So if you'll put me now and ask me to solve this, I will answer for 5 minutes and then I'll stop. I lose interest very fast. Why do they do it? So the production function, the result is based on ability and the effort that you put on the test. Now, if the effort part of it is just noise and it's the same everywhere, that's not a problem. But what if, so I'm going to talk about China versus the US. China, Shanghai was ranked number 1. The US number 36. What if the kids in Shanghai, if you ask them to sit down and answer the test, they sit and answer the test, and the kids in the US say, whatever, right? I don't want to do it. Then the conclusion that you get out of the test is wrong. It's not that you need to change to increase the ability of the 15-year-old kids in the US, but you need to actually try and understand how to measure it better. So the policy implication could be really important. So what we did, it's together with Sally Sedoff, John List, and Jeff, that we'll have to forgive him because I don't remember his last name. We ran an experiment in the US and in Shanghai. So in US, we did it in a couple of schools. In Shanghai, we did it in a few schools. And the idea was very simple. We took 25 questions that PISA actually releases. So it's out of the PISA test, 25 questions in math. And we gave the students time, and they solved the test. We look at it, we see gaps as very much in line with the results of the PISA test. So far, so good. Now we introduce incentives. Now we tell the students, different students of course, when they sit down, here's $25. For every question that you miss, that you don't answer correctly, we're going to take $1 from you. So it's not a paper about incentives, but those of you that we're trying to use loss aversion and other aspects that, we pay them immediately. So we try to make the incentives large and important. What we do now is basically give them a reason to sit down and work hard on the test. We do it again in China and in the US. We find that in China there is almost no improvement. Basically, there is no improvement in China. Whereas in the US, we see a big jump that closes about half of the gap between the two countries. So the conclusion that the US students are not smart enough, or not, the ability of the students is not high enough, is just wrong. Right? So to close half of the gap, you need, so it's equivalent of investment of probably hundreds of billions of dollars in order to get there, right? The reason I'm raising this is that the policy implication that you want, I didn't mention maybe, but the money that they get is just when they sit down to solve the test. They don't know about it in advance, so they don't study for the test. They just, when they sit down, we tell them, by the way, you're going to get this incentive. The reason I started with this is to show you the importance of using experiments in order to try and diagnose your problem correctly. You cannot solve it if you don't understand the problem, right? And that's I think, a crucial element in anything that we do in behavioral economics, at least. So there are people that write models in behavioral economics. That's something very different than what I'm doing. But if you look at the stuff that I think is more relevant here, it's really understood. It's really crucial to have the right empirical data. Okay. By the way, who do you think was affected more by incentives? 15-year-old boys or 15-year-old girls? Girls? Who thinks differently? Boys, yeah, you're right. Boys were much more affected. So at least to me, intuitively, that's what I thought, right? So that, the boys sit down and say, I don't care, and just move on. And girls, you ask them, they are nicer, and for some reason. So they were more affected, at least. So I hope that I convinced you, those of you that needed to be convinced, probably not many of you in this room, that we need to collect data. Now, the reason I don't call myself an experimental economist anymore, but a behavioral economist, because experiments are one tool. So lab experiments is one example, field experiments is another. Some people work with real data. Those are just tools. That's not how I define myself as, I care about behavioral questions. So let's look at some examples with incentives. So one example that of a study that we did with Humana. Humana is a big insurance company in the US. So they have members that are registered to Medicare. Medicare are people over 65 that get, until 65, basically it's very expensive. After 65, it's subsidized. When you reach 65, the health insurance is subsidized by the government through a private company. And Humana is one of these private companies. There's noise. The nice thing about it is that they have the right incentives. So they make more money if you are registered to them and you're healthy. So Humana really wants you to be healthy, which is good, right? I wouldn't want to work with a company that benefits from killing you. They'll have to pay me more, at least. As part of trying to get the people to be healthier, they came up with a list of about 30 activities that they want you to do. So that could be flu shot, cancer screening, I don't know, all the good stuff that you need to do when you get older, right? Colonoscopia, and so on. And they really recommended this for the member that they should do it. Now, the members are not that good at keeping themselves healthy, like we said before. So Humana wanted to motivate them. And the motivation was $10 per activity, up to 5 activities a year. So you can get up to $50 if you do 5 activities, $20 if you do 2 activities, and so on. We're talking about a big program, order of magnitude of $100 million a year. So it's a lot of money that they wanted to invest in this. And they have all the charts, and they know the statistics. They know that if you get a flu shot, it reduces the chance that you'll end up in the ER by X. So they know they can value this, and clearly $10 is something that they'll be very happy to pay if that will get you to do this. The problem with such incentives is that very often you give it to people who are not really affected by it. So how many of you already got a flu shot, for example, this year? Only one. So in the US, that would be 70% of the people. But so you got a flu shot. Yep. If the doctor would have offered you $10 also in addition, would you take the $10? Of course, right? but you would not have been influenced by it, right? So it would be a waste of money, right? And that's what we thought, you know, how do we know whether this incentive scheme actually works or it's a waste of money? So what we did it's not really an experiment, but what we did, the change that we made was, in the following year, you got no incentives to do 1, 2, 3, or 4 activities, and you got $50 if you did 5 activities. And the idea was that if you're really motivated by the incentives, you'll go and do 5 activities. And otherwise, if you're like you will just not collect the money, so they'll save the money. And actually, when we ran this, we found almost no difference between the 2 cases. A bit more people did 5 activities, and that's it. No other difference. Which means that most of the money, or maybe even all of the money of the $100 million, was basically money, you know, money for nothing. The incentives did not work. Now, the point is that that kind of thinking is relevant in many, many industries. If you look at the car industry, for example, only in the US, the incentives that they give are $50 billion a year. So the car industry in the US spends $50 billion a year on incentives. That's a huge amount of money. And very large parts of it are wasted on people that would have bought the car anyway. So imagine that you are the person in charge in BMW, say, the US. This person would have $4 or $5 billion to spend on incentives. And most of these incentives would go to people that, you know, I'm going into the BMW dealership, I want to buy the Series 3 car. And then they tell me, oh, by the way, there is a $4,000 incentive program now. Sure, I'll take it, but that did not change my behavior. And they, of course, they are not naive people. These people are very smart, you know, they're dealing with lots of money, they have lots of experience, they understand this problem. They try to create programs that will bypass this. So, for example, they have special incentives if you come with an equivalent car. So if you come with a Lexus or Mercedes, they will give you incentives to buy BMW, which is, of course, problematic because if you come with a BMW and they don't give you, they give it to other people, that's very problematic, but they try to bypass it this way. If you look at wellness programs, imagine that you work in a company and the company wants to get people to stop smoking, for example. A bad program would be a program that would pay people who don't smoke. Because most of the people at the university, for example, of the faculty at least, don't smoke. So if you pay everyone, basically the amount of money that reaches the marginal consumer, the one that you can influence, is very small. If you want people to have a good BMI and you pay them according to their BMI, it would be a problem because you'll also pay lots of money to people who don't need to lose weight. So you want to try and target the heavier people, which of course is also raises other issues like fairness and things like that. So targeting the incentive is one very important thing to do. And when you use incentive, you need to make sure that you don't just create incentives that have no real effect on behavior. And wellness program, that's the next thing I'll talk about. Wellness programs are really, the amounts of money that are spent on it are huge, usually without any empirical data. So no one actually studies what happens. If someone studies, it's usually the company that actually provide it. And guess what? They find that it's effective, right? It's trying to base it on more empirical data would be very important. So one of the things that we did, Gary Charnes and I ran an experiment a few years ago in which we gave students $100 to go to the gym for a month. So during 1 month, they had to go 8 times to the gym. And we wanted to see what will happen if, you know, after we stop paying them. So if during the time when you pay them $100, they're more likely to go to the gym. That's not, you know, if I pay my student $100, they do almost anything that I want them to do. But the question was, what will happen when we stop paying them? So you can think about crowding out like we discussed before. So there's lots of literature, including my papers, but many others, that show that if I pay you money, I change your perception of why you're doing this activity, and it could actually backfire. So it could be that I'm giving you money to do the activity, but actually what you understand from that is that the activity is not that important and you are less likely to do it. So there is a joke that I like. A dean goes to the students, the freshmen, you know, the first year students, and tells them, you know, this is not one of these schools. Over here, the boys are going to be in the boys' dorms and the girls are going to be in the girls' dorm. The first time we catch you in the wrong dorm after 9 p.m., you're going to get a $50 fine. The second time you get a $120 fine. And the third time that we catch you, you'll get $300 fine. Any questions? So one of the boys raises his hand and asks, can I buy a monthly pass? So you really change the perception of why I'm doing this, right? And that's bad, right? So that's not something that you want to happen. So that could be one thing that happens as a result of paying people to go to the gym. The other one could be some kind of habit formation. And I use habit formation in a very loose way. So economists usually talk about the Becker-Murphy model, which means that the more I exercise before, the more I'm going to enjoy it today. But it could be because of, you know, I just found time in my schedule. So now I know that on Monday and Thursday at 9 a.m. I go to yoga classes. Or, you know, the first time I went to the gym, it smelled horribly. And after a month, I started enjoying the smell. Could be many reasons why, but maybe we'll see something like that. What we found was, in this initial experiment, we found that after the month when we stopped paying them, the group that got paid was much more likely to keep going to the gym. Right? So there was some positive effect even after we stopped paying them, which was, you know, very encouraging for us because it's not easy to get positive results over there. By the way, other people replicated it and found that once there is a change, it usually disappears. So winter break, summer break, people stop following this habit. What's interesting, that's a new set of results that we have, is that we find that they are much better academically. So if we pay students to go to the gym, while we are paying them to go to the gym, they actually go to the gym more often, and they are more successful in their academic studies. So that's a paper with Bertil and Alexander from Bergen and Gary, in which we pay people to go to the gym, and we have all the information. In Norway, you can get all the information about people. And we see that these students, while they go to the gym, they're also doing much better academically. So it seems to have some kind of benefit for this. Right? So that's a positive thing. I'll get back to wellness in a second, but the one thing that, you know, the center of what I sent in the abstract, I think, I don't know if people got it as part of the email, but is about the fungibility of money. So the next few examples will be about that. And the idea is that even when incentives work, very often we can make them work even better. It's not enough that they work. So in one study, we worked with Edmunds.com. It's a company in LA. If you look for a car in the US, you put in Toyota Camry, you'll get few, it's called third-party websites that will give you reviews of cars, will tell you which car is better. And then once you're ready to purchase, you put in your zip code, and they show you ads from dealerships that has the same car in your neighborhood. And Edmunds.com is being paid when you click on the ad and submit your details to the dealership such that they can call you and talk with you about selling you the car. So Edmunds really wants you to actually submit your lead, because that's how they make money. And in order to do this, they introduced a discount of $500 if you submit the lead through Edmunds. So if you want to buy a $20,000 car, you get a discount of $500 if you do it through Edmunds. $500 is a lot of money, and it did have an effect. The problem is that very often we think about differences, about values, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. So while $500 is a lot of money, it's not that much relative to $20,000. So Kahneman and Tversky have these examples that I'll give my version of it. Imagine that you want to buy a mouse for your computer, and it costs $100. You go to the shop, and the salesperson tells you, if you'll go 10 minutes away, you can buy it for $20 less. Many of us will do that. Now imagine that you want to buy a laptop that costs $2,000, and the seller tells you the same, that if you go 10 minutes, you'll get it for $20 less. You'll probably say, it's not worth it, right? Although it's $20, if it's worth walking 10 minutes for $20, it shouldn't matter. The absolute amount shouldn't matter. It does matter, right? So we often think about it this way. So we thought that, these $500, while a lot of money, maybe are lost when you do it in this kind of environment. And we wanted to use something that Richard Thaler called mental accounting. In the early 80s already started the discussion of that. The idea of mental accounting is that not all costs are created equal. Not all money is created equal. We put them in different cells in our brain. So the hosts were very generous to offer me $10,000 for coming here today. And I'm much more likely to spend this money on buying some fancy stuff than something that comes out of salary. So another example, if I'll go to a restaurant and very often, you can see yourself looking for parking for half an hour in order to save 10 euros. But then when you buy the bottle of wine, you don't really care about 10 euros, right? You're there to enjoy. Because spending the money on wine is fun and good. Spending it on parking is annoying. Right, so very often in the US, when you go to the airport and you want to get this trolley to get your stuff, you have to pay, I don't know, $5. And very often, it's just 100 meters, so very often, I break my back and whatever going like this in order to save the $5 and feel really good about myself for that. And then I go and buy in Starbucks, I don't know, coffee that costs $12 over there, and that's fine, it's coffee, I'm not that cheap, right? It's just different kind of. We wanted to see whether we can use this kind of logic in incentives in order to improve incentives. So we looked for something that people don't like spending money on that relates to cars. And we thought that, paying for gas is something that we don't like to do. And $500 for gas is a lot of money, right? So I'm not going to compare it to the 20,000 as much because, it's different. We thought that that would be much more effective. So we ran the experiment. It's done online, so it's very easy to do. Well, relatively easy to do. $500 discount was effective. $500 in gas card was way more effective. Significantly, both statistically and economically more effective. And we actually played with the amount of the gas card down all the way to $200. And it was still more effective than $500 discount. Right, so $200 in gas card was more effective than $500 in discount. And first of all, it shows that it's the first example that this fungibility principle is broken in a sense, right? That you can use it for incentives. As a side note, it also shows you why experiments are so important, because no one in his right mind, if you'll ask someone, what do you prefer, $500 discount or $200 in gas card? No one would say $200 in gas card. But when you look at behavior, at actual behavior, you see that it's more effective. Right? And that's the kind of things that, again, if you want to motivate people, it's important to understand. So inspired a bit by the success of this, we wanted to use it in a more wellness-related environment. And we did it in Singapore with taxi drivers. Now, taxi drivers have health issues because they sit 10, 12 hours a day and they don't do any physical activity during this time. Very unhealthy for them. It's, by the way, also very unhealthy for us. I have this walking station now that when I work, I can walk, and that's amazing, highly recommended. But taxi drivers have health issues. The company told us, can you help us get them to walk more? For us, it's a really good objective because the company really thinks stuff that we don't know if it's true. We don't know if walking more will actually help the company. But we don't need to care about it. Well, we're going to measure it, but we care about achieving the goal that the company stated to us. Can we use incentives to actually get people to walk more? And we know that if we'll pay them, they'll walk more. Again, we wanted to see whether we can use the fungibility principle in order to get this result. So we defined a goal. The goal was walking 7,000 steps a day. By the way, do you know how many steps you're supposed to walk every day? 10,000. You know why? What's the science behind it? I learned just last week. So it turns out that the first Fitbit that came out of Japan could count only until 10,000. So that's the 10,000, right? I don't know if it's a true story, but it's as good as any other story that you'll hear about 10,000. There is no research behind these kind of things. It's really all very problematic. By the way, as a side note of that, I'll talk about depression in a second. So to make you happy, I'll talk about depression. Taxi drivers walk less, so we measured for 21 days, we measured the group of taxi drivers. We saw that they walk about 5,000, so we came up with the number 7,000, which has the same scientific backup as any other number that we could come up with. When you run experiments like this, that takes a couple of years and a lot of money. Very often you have to make arbitrary choices because you can't test. We can't test 7,000 and 8,000, it's just not feasible. So we came with something that, based on the goal literature, that it's better than what they're doing now, but not unattainable, right? If you would have asked them to walk 25,000 a day, they wouldn't. So we gave them a goal of walking 7,000 steps a day for 20 days a week. 20 days a month, that's easier. And so for every driver that we have, the first 21 days we just measured how many steps they walked. Then for 4 months we gave them this incentive, and the incentive was if you meet the target, you get $100 at the end of the month. That's the regular incentives. And the other one, we looked for something that is aversive for them. Something that they really hate paying for is the rent of the taxi. So every day that they go to work, they have to pay a daily rent of $100 for the taxi itself, to the company. And when you drive with the drivers, they'll often tell you, until noon I drive to cover the rental cost, then until 2 the fuel cost, and only then I start making money. So it's something that they really hate and is very strong in their mind. So again, like with the gas cards, we thought that it might be more effective. So one group gets $100, the other group get this day off of the lease for 4 months, and then we followed up again, and we saw that the $100 were effective. The increase in the number of steps when we used the daily rent was double than the $100. And it's really interesting because in this case, they were paid exactly the same. It was transferred into their bank account. We just called it differently. Instead of calling it $100, we said the day lease of your car. That's the only difference between the two. And yet the effect was more than double when we did it this way. So, and by the way, maybe later you'll ask me about how do we know that they don't cheat, because with the Fitbit you can cheat, you can give it to your son or whatever. And some of them did cheat, so some of them walked like 300,000 steps a day, which is, it's like a few marathons a day. We know it because we had also 3 months later in which we followed up without giving them incentives. So we gave them incentives to come and be tested by us, so we can look at it, but we didn't pay them to actually meet the target. And yet we saw the same increase. It went down a bit, but not by a lot. So we saw some kind of habit formation and much stronger habit with the group that got the rental. So the fungibility stuff is important. Now, the depressing thing that I wanted to say about depression is true in general about physicians, about doctors. So if you ask psychiatrists what will help against depression, what's the best thing against depression other than all the drugs that they have? Exercising. Every psychiatrist that I asked, and if you look at the textbook, exercising is really good against depression. And every psychiatrist can tell you his or her story about the patient that they had and nothing helped until they started exercising. And of course they get the causality completely, they don't understand what we mean by causality. And people who know people with depression know that it's not that someone depressed, you can't get them to go and brush their teeth. They start exercising when they feel better. They don't feel better when they start exercising. Or maybe they do, but there's no experiment actually that tries to control for this and try to give us the answer. Is it really exercising that makes them feel better? Or when they start feeling better, they start exercising, right? And that's just an example about, what's much of the medical profession is based on. When you talk about evidence, you talk with doctors, they really do not understand statistics, and we can try and help with some of these things. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. I can keep on talking about incentives for another few hours until the last one will fall asleep. I'll try to wrap it up, and then we can go back to some of it in the Q&A at the end. If you understand how incentives work, you can make them much more efficient. You can make them work much better than if you just throw. So very often, first of all, for economists, incentives and motivation are the same, and they're clearly not the same. And if we understand our incentive, I gave you a few examples in which either incentives don't work, or you can make them work much better if you are using the right behavioral understanding of things. So the idea is very much different than the big data kind of discussion in which you look for correlation and in trillions of data points. The idea is to start with some targeted assumption or behavioral finding that you have, usually from the lab, and then try to use this, find a creative way to use it in the field to actually make your incentives work better, right? So I think that's the challenge, and that's the more fun aspect of what we're doing today. So to take the understanding from psychology and try to create experiments that show that it works, and then from these experiments, so some things don't work, you improve and improve and improve. So it's not a process that, at the end we'll find the optimal incentives. There are no optimal incentives, fortunately. Fortunately, incentives are complicated, and we'll keep looking for a long time. At least, my lifetime, I can still play with incentives and find what to do with it. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a difficult task now to come here, particularly with my background coming from the banking industry, where if you think about what happened in the banking industry in the last, or since 2008, then many people of you here would say, okay, where there was some clear misled incentives systems in place that led to some behaviors in the banking industry, which then resulted ultimately maybe in the financial crisis that really hit or that grew into an economic crisis. So let me maybe twist a little bit here and say, if I'm talking of our industry, then maybe the name or the label incentives has become also a bad or a not that good reputation. So, but when I'm looking at the meaning, as I understood it from your description now, then we might talk about rewards. And rewards, for me, has a much better connotation, maybe achieving the same. Because when in our industry somebody talks about incentives, then it's about sales incentives. Yeah. So how much do I pay the bank tellers for selling you a loan or an insurance or something like that, which has, particularly in the eyes of the regulator right now, the connotation, well, be aware, because these crooks in the banks, they want to sell you something that you actually don't want, don't need, and it's even dangerous. So that's why we are more looking into, actually moving away from incentivation or bonus systems, which does not mean to move away from rewards, because I'm fully with you that actually we should be looking much more into how can we change the behavior, and this is done by maybe several means, and paying something is one element, because I'm also a strong believer in what has been mentioned here, that incentive is not equals motivation. Motivation is something completely different. And we all know that when I'm looking at you, and asking you, okay, what is motivating you, then I probably would get 2, 3, 4, 5 different answers. And this is always the challenge if you want to, get people to do something different into, how can I address this and get people motivated? And money there is maybe one element, but certainly not the only one. It's one element that can help to change behavior, but there are many more others that any supervisor, any manager that is leading people, should know, and is faced with the challenges when it comes to motivation. What I liked very much is that sometimes it's the little things. that make the change, that can make people change their behaviors. And the interesting thing is when companies come to consultants, they want the big answer. Yeah, say, okay, we have a problem, now you come and you solve it for us. And very often one has to find out, well, is the answer that a consultant or a specific consultant provides really the answer that you want, and that if the approach really fits to your organization. I think what we also need to be careful about is an approach, and there are many approaches around, and if you look into academic, I think there are many opinions around, and everybody is fighting for his or her opinion to be the right one. But does this opinion or this offer that is made really fit to the requirements or the culture or the problem that you have? So it's, I think, also up to us then to decide, okay, what makes most sense for us. And I have come across in my career quite a few consultants that want to sell their approach that in some occasion it worked, with many supposedly, but they don't tell you where it did not work. So that is something everybody has to find out yourself. But what I like with the behavioral economics topic is that there is some data behind. Yeah? Very often, also, I know that academics are here, but very often we hear, yes, we have thought this thoroughly through and there has been whatever research done, but if you go down and dig into, is there really hard facts, hard data, practical data behind, then I'm not sure whether this is always the case. If you have some data, some hard data, then this is the ground for making your conclusions. But I'm also not questioning, and this is the antithesis to what I've just said, data is also not everything. You also have to make your own conclusion, the right conclusion of the data you have. And you have to find the right question. If you don't have the right question, all the data is useless to you. And you have to make what also was mentioned today, the right connections, because I've given you an example that fits nicely in here. In 2015, we dramatically reduced the amount of variable pay in our organization, so that people really significantly got a lower bonus. So what would you expect would be the performance, the impact on the performance of the people? What would be the logic? Did
you increase fixed pay?
We slightly increased fixed pay, yes. But there was clearly not a one-to-one exchange rate. What happened? What do you think? Nothing, no. And now it's about connecting the data points here. Actually, from 2015 to 2016, our net profit increased by 22%. Really, these are hard numbers. Would you now make the conclusion that the reduction of the variable pay resulted into 22% increase of return? Probably not. Yeah. So, also we didn't it. So the point that I wanted to make is, even if you have the data, then you need to draw your right conclusions out of this. And whenever you get some data, have a certain amount of critical view behind before you really come to the conclusions. That's actually the last point, but obviously to sum up, having some good data that supports how you can change behavior is a very interesting thing that I'm 100% sure companies will look into much more in the future, because at the end, what counts are the results. And here I have to say, not the academic papers, but it's the results that companies can find ultimately in their balance sheet. Okay, thank you.
Uri, would you come? First, thank you, Uri, and thank you, Rudi, and I think we gave them a big applause.